My name is Elise, and I'm 29. I'm sitting in a lawyer's office, heart racing, surrounded by my family's cold stares. The air feels thick like something's about to break. My sister Hannah smirks across the table, and my parents' eyes avoid mine. I've always felt like the odd one out, but today I hoped for fairness. A dusty envelope sits on the desk unnoticed by everyone but me. What's inside? Have you ever felt invisible in your family? Share where you're watching from below, and please like or subscribe to join my story. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and lemon polish, the kind of place where secrets get buried in fine print. I sat rigid, my hands clasped so tight my knuckles ached, still reeling from the weight of that moment in the hook. Hannah's smirk lingered in my mind, but now her eyes glinted with something sharper, like she knew what was coming. My parents sat across from me, their faces unreadable, though Mom's lips twitched slightly as if holding back a thought. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should, each second stretching the silence until it felt like a taut wire about to snap. Mr. Larson, the lawyer, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. His voice was steady, almost mechanical, as he began reading the will. I leaned forward, my breath shallow, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, my parents had seen me after all these years. I'd spent my life trying to prove I was enough, staying late at the family business, sketching designs for new products, even when no one asked. I wasn't expecting millions, just a nod, a sign I mattered. He started with Hannah. $10 million, the family estate in Napa, and full control of Dad's tech company. My stomach twisted, but I forced a smile, telling myself it made sense. She was the golden child, always had been. Hannah's shoulders straightened and she tossed her hair back, her diamond earrings catching the light. Greg, her husband, leaned over and squeezed her hand, his grin wide enough to show his back teeth. I looked at Mom, expecting her to meet my eyes to soften the blow, but she stared at her lap, folding and unfolding a tissue. Then Mr. Larson turned to me. I held my breath, my fingers digging into my palms. He paused, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't read, maybe pity. He said my parents had prepared a message for me, something they wanted me to hear directly. My heart sank. A message. Not a share, not a mention in the will, but words. I glanced at Aunt Clara, who sat to my right, her brows knitting together. She reached for Uncle Ray's arm, her rings clinking softly against his watch. Mr. Larson slid a tablet across the desk and tapped the screen. My parents' faces appeared recorded in their living room, the one with the leather couch I was never allowed to sit on as a kid. Dad's voice came first, calm but firm. He said they'd thought long and hard about their decision. Mom nodded beside him, her eyes fixed somewhere off camera. They believed Hannah had the vision to carry their legacy forward, to grow the company, to keep the family name strong. I swallowed hard, waiting for my name for anything. Then Dad looked straight into the camera, and it felt like he was seeing me, really seeing me for the first time in years. He said, "Elise, you're strong, but you need to learn to stand on your own. We're giving you nothing because we know you can earn your own way." Mom's lips pressed into a thin line like she was swallowing something bitter, and she added, "It's for your own good, honey." The video ended, the screen fading to black. The room spun. My ears rang, drowning out the clock's ticking. Nothing. Not a dime, not a keepsake, not even a share of the business I'd poured my heart into. My parents, who'd framed Hannah's every report card, who'd flown her to Paris for her 16th birthday, while I got a used laptop, had just written me out of their lives. I stared at the table, my vision blurring, trying to anchor myself to the grain of the wood. Hannah let out a soft laugh, barely audible, but it cut like a blade. She leaned toward Greg and whispered something, her hand covering her mouth. Greg chuckled, his eyes darting to me, and I caught his words, low and smug. She never had a chance. My cheeks burned, and I wanted to scream, to demand why, but my throat felt sealed shut. Aunt Clara shifted in her seat, her voice sharp as she muttered to Uncle Ray, "This isn't right." Ray patted her hand, but his jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the floor. I tried to breathe, to process, but memories flooded in. I was 12, standing in the kitchen, showing Mom a poem I'd written. She'd glanced at it, then handed it back, saying, Hannah's got a debate tournament this weekend. Let's focus on that. Or the summer I was 18 working unpaid at the company organizing files, while Hannah partied in Greece. I'd told myself it was fine that love wasn't measured in money or attention, but now sitting here, I felt like a fool. Mr. Larson shuffled his papers, his voice breaking the silence. He said there were a few more details to cover, but I barely heard him. My hands trembled in my lap and I pressed them against my thighs, willing them to stop. I looked at Aunt Clara, hoping for some kind of anchor, but she was whispering to Ray again, her face pale. Hannah's smirk widened, and Greg leaned back in his chair, his arm draped over her shoulder like they'd just won the lottery. Which I guess they had. I wanted to run to disappear, but my legs felt like lead. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something worse. What had I done to deserve this? Was I really so invisible, so unworthy that my own parents could erase me like this? I didn't know what came next, but the weight of their words pressed harder, and I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The silence in the lawyer's office was suffocating, broken only by the rustle of Mr. Larson's papers as he moved on to minor estate details. I couldn't focus. My parents' recorded words looped in my head, each syllable a fresh bruise. Stand on your own, for your own good. My chest tightened, and I pressed my hands harder against my thighs, trying to ground myself. Hannah's soft laugh still echoed in my ears, and I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for me to crack. I glanced around, desperate for something to hold on to. Aunt Clara's face was still pale, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarf. Uncle Ray murmured something to her, his voice too low to catch, but his shoulders were hunched like he was bracing for a storm. Across the table, Greg adjusted his tie, his grin replaced by a smug tilt of his lips. Hannah leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed as if this was just another Tuesday. My mother finally looked up from her tissue, her gaze sliding past me to the window like I wasn't even there. Mr. Larson's voice droned on about property taxes, but my mind drifted to a memory I hadn't touched in years. I was 15, sitting at the dining table, showing Dad a marketing plan I'd drawn up for the company. It was just a school project, but I'd spent weeks on it, sketching logos, researching competitors. He'd skimmed it for 10 seconds, then slid it back, saying, "Hannah's got a real head for this stuff. You should ask her for tips." I'd nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and tucked the plan away in a drawer. It was still there in my old bedroom, gathering dust. The memory stung sharper now in this room where my worth had been measured and found wanting. I shifted in my seat, the chair creaking, and Greg's eyes flicked to me. He leaned toward Hannah, his voice a stage whisper. "Guess some people just aren't cut out for the big leagues, huh?" Hannah's lips curved and she tilted her head like she was studying a disappointing painting. My pulse pounded in my ears and I gripped the armrests, my nails digging into the wood. Aunt Clara's voice cut through sharp and sudden. "That's enough, Greg." Her tone was low, but it carried and the room stilled. Greg raised an eyebrow, but Hannah touched his arm, silencing him. Clara's eyes met mine, fierce and steady, and for a moment I felt seen. But then Mom spoke, her voice cool and clipped. "Clara, let's not make a scene. This is a private matter." Clara's jaw tightened, and she looked away, her hands balling into fists. I wanted to thank Clara, to grab her hand and beg her to keep talking, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I stared at the table, tracing the scratches in the varnish, each one a tiny rebellion against the polished surface. My thoughts spiraled. Had I been delusional, thinking I'd ever had a place in this family? I'd stayed late at the office, fixed problems. Hannah never touched, smiled through every slight. And for what? To be told I needed to earn my own way like I hadn't been trying my whole life. Mr. Larson cleared his throat again, signaling the end of the meeting. He mentioned a follow-up session next week, something about additional paperwork, but his words blurred together. People started to stand, chairs scraping against the floor. Hannah smoothed her skirt and turned to Greg, her voice bright. "We should celebrate tonight. Maybe that new place downtown?" Greg nodded, already pulling out his phone, probably booking a table for two. I stayed seated, my legs heavy like they'd forgotten how to move. Aunt Clara lingered by the door, her eyes searching mine, but Uncle Ray gently tugged her arm and they left. Mom gathered her purse, her movements precise, and walked out without a glance. I was alone with the weight of it all, the room emptying out like my hopes. My fingers brushed the edge of my chair, and I noticed a small frayed thread in the upholstery unraveling just like me. As I stood, my purse slipped from my lap, spilling pens and a crumpled receipt onto the floor. I knelt to pick them up, my hands shaking, and caught sight of that dusty envelope again, still sitting on Mr. Larson's desk. It was thicker than I'd realized, sealed with a wax stamp, the kind Grandpa used to use for his letters. My heart skipped a flicker of curiosity cutting through the fog. What was it? Why hadn't anyone mentioned it? I straightened, clutching my purse, and forced myself to walk out. The hallway was dim, the air cooler, but my skin burned with questions. Hannah's laughter drifted from the parking lot light and careless, and it fueled something in me, something raw and unyielding. This wasn't over. I didn't know what came next, but the sting of their rejection was sharpening into something else, something that felt like defiance. The family mansion felt like a museum, all polished marble and chandeliers, but tonight it was a stage for Hannah's victory. I sat at the long dining table, the same one where I'd eaten cereal alone as a kid, while Mom planned Hannah's ballet recitals. The celebration dinner was in full swing with clinking glasses and forced laughter. Hannah held court at the head, her voice bright as she described a yacht she planned to rent for a Caribbean getaway. Greg nodded along his fork poised over a slice of prime rib, his eyes glinting with approval. I pushed a piece of asparagus around my plate, my appetite gone. The chandelier's light cast harsh shadows, and every laugh from the other end of the table felt like a jab. My navy dress, the one I'd chosen to look composed, clung to my skin suddenly too tight. I kept replaying the lawyer's office dad's voice on that video telling me to stand on my own, Mom's cold avoidance. The envelope I'd seen sealed and mysterious flickered in my mind, but it felt like a faint hope drowned out by the noise around me. Across the table, Aunt Clara sipped her wine, her lips pursed. Uncle Ray murmured something to her, but she shook her head, her eyes darting to me. I wanted to ask her what she'd meant in the office, why she'd called it unfair, but the words stuck. Instead, I caught the eye of Mia, my old high school friend, now a server here. She moved quietly, refilling water glasses, her dark braid swinging. When she passed me, her hand brushed my shoulder, and I felt a folded note slip into my lap. I tucked it under the table, my heart racing. Hannah's voice cut through sharp and performative. I'm thinking we'll redo the Napa estate too, make it more modern. Greg chimed in, saying they'd gut the old library Dad loved, the one with his leather-bound books and that creaky desk where I used to do homework. My stomach twisted. That library was Dad's heart, where he'd told me stories of starting the company from nothing. I'd always imagined keeping it untouched, a piece of him that felt like mine. Now Hannah was erasing it just like they'd erased me. I unfolded Mia's note, keeping it low. In her neat handwriting it read, "You're worth more than this. Don't let them win." My throat tightened and I glanced at her. She was clearing plates, her face neutral, but her eyes met mine for a split second, fierce and steady. I tucked the note into my pocket, my fingers lingering on the paper, a small anchor in the storm. Mom stood, her silk scarf fluttering, and gestured for me to follow her to the hallway. I hesitated, my legs heavy, but I rose, smoothing my dress. The chatter faded as we stepped into the dim corridor, the air cooler, but no less suffocating. She turned to me, her face a mask of calm, her pearls gleaming against her neck. "Elise, you need to stop this," she said, her voice low but sharp. "You're making everyone uncomfortable, acting like this is about you." I blinked, my breath catching. "Uncomfortable," I said, my voice shaking. "You and Dad just cut me out of everything, and I'm the one making it about me." Her eyes narrowed and she crossed her arms. "You've always been too sensitive," she said. "Hannah's earned her place. You need to grow up and accept it." Each word landed like a slap, and I felt my chest constrict, the air thinning. I wanted to scream, to ask why my years of work, my loyalty, my quiet endurance meant nothing. Instead, I stood frozen, my hands clenching at my sides. A memory hit me unbidden. I was 19 hauling boxes in the company warehouse, sweat soaking my shirt, while Hannah was in London posting photos from some fancy internship Dad had arranged. I'd called Mom that night exhausted but proud, and she'd said, "That's nice, honey, but Hannah's meeting with investors tomorrow." I'd hung up alone in the break room, promising myself I'd prove I was enough. Back in the hallway, Mom's gaze softened. But it wasn't warmth, it was pity. "Just try to be happy for your sister," she said, then turned and walked back to the dining room, her heels clicking. I leaned against the wall, my knees weak, the note in my pocket burning against my thigh. The unfairness of it all, Hannah's triumph, Mom's dismissal, the library's fate churned inside me a rising tide of anger and grief. I wasn't just invisible, I was being erased piece by piece. The dining room buzzed with clinking silverware and hollow chatter, but it felt like I was underwater, every sound muffled, every glance a weight pulling me deeper. I sat back down, my hands still trembling from Mom's words in the hallway, her pity searing into me. Hannah's toast lingered in the air, her glass still raised, and the guests' smiles seemed to mock me. I gripped Mia's note in my pocket, its edges creasing under my fingers, but even its encouragement felt distant now, like a lifeline just out of reach. I tried to focus on my plate, the untouched asparagus now cold, but my eyes kept drifting to the framed photo on the mantel behind Hannah. It was from a family trip to Tahoe when I was 10, all of us smiling by the lake. I'd found it years later in a box, half torn, my face barely visible at the edge. I'd taped it back together, thinking it meant something, proof we'd been a family once. Now seeing it displayed like a trophy, I realized it was just another prop in Hannah's story, one where I was a footnote. Uncle Ray cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the noise. He raised his glass, his smile strained. "To family unity," he said, his eyes flickering to me. "Let's keep what matters in focus." Aunt Clara nodded, but her knuckles were white around her wine glass. The table fell quiet, and for a moment I thought someone might acknowledge the fracture, the gaping hole where I'd been cut out. But Hannah laughed, a sharp, brittle sound, and said, "Oh, Ray, don't get sentimental. We're all fine, aren't we, Elise?" Her words were a challenge, her gaze pinning me like a butterfly to a board. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Greg smirked, leaning back in his chair, and whispered something to the man next to him, a cousin I barely knew. The cousin chuckled, and my cheeks burned. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, but I was trapped, every eye in the room, a spotlight on my silence. Aunt Clara set her glass down hard, the sound sharp enough to make Mom flinch. Clara's voice was low, trembling with restraint. "Hannah, that's enough. You don't need to rub it in." Mom's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "Clara, stay out of it," she said, her tone icy. "This is between my daughters and me." Clara's face reddened, and she leaned forward, her voice rising. "Between them, you call this fair, Margaret? You've always favored Hannah, and now you've humiliated Elise in front of everyone." The room froze. Guests shifted uncomfortably, forks pausing midair. Uncle Ray touched Clara's arm, murmuring her name, but she shook him off. Mom's lips parted, but no sound came. I stared at Clara, my heart pounding, grateful for her defense, but terrified of the fault lines it exposed. This wasn't just about the will, it was decades of unspoken grudges, of Mom and Clara's rivalry as sisters of a family that had never been whole. Hannah broke the silence, her voice syrupy sweet. "Aunt Clara, I get that you're upset, but Elise is fine. She's tough, right?" She turned to me, her smile a blade. "Tell them you're okay, Elise. Go on." My throat closed, and I felt the weight of every stare, every expectation. I wanted to scream that I wasn't okay, that I was drowning, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, a small, jerky motion, and hated myself for it. Greg laughed, loud and deliberate, shattering the tension. "See, all good. Let's eat." The table stirred back to life, conversations resuming, but the air felt heavier, charged with things unsaid. I glanced at Mia, who was stacking plates near the door, her jaw tight. She caught my eye and mouthed, "Stay strong," but it felt like a plea I couldn't answer. My hands shook as I reached for my water glass, the liquid sloshing slightly. A memory surfaced unbidden from when I was 20, sitting in the company break room after a long shift. I'd overheard Mom on the phone bragging about Hannah's promotion to a role I'd trained her for. She'd said, "Hannah's the one who'll take us forward. Elise is just reliable. Reliable." The word had gutted me then, and now it echoed a reminder that I'd never been more than a shadow in their eyes. As dessert was served, a creamy cheesecake I couldn't stomach, I overheard Hannah and Greg again, their voices low but clear. They were planning to sell off the company's smaller divisions, the ones I'd helped build, to fund their new ventures. My chest ached, not just for me, but for Dad's legacy, the late nights he'd spent sketching ideas, the pride he'd taken in every detail. I'd believed in that legacy, worked for it, loved it, and now it was theirs to dismantle. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping, and excused myself, my voice barely audible. The hallway was dark, the mansion's grandeur closing in like a tomb. I leaned against a wall, my breath ragged. Mia's note crumpled in my fist. The anger was there, hot and sharp, but beneath it was something heavier: grief for a family I'd never truly had, for a place I'd never belonged. The dinner wasn't over, but I felt it coming, a storm I couldn't outrun, and I didn't know if I had the strength to face it. A week after the dinner, I was back in Mr. Larson's office, the same wood-paneled room that had unraveled my world. The air was stale, the clock still ticking like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. I sat alone at the table, my hands folded, my navy coat draped over the chair. The follow-up meeting was supposed to tie up loose ends, but my nerves were raw, frayed from nights of replaying Mom's dismissal and Hannah's laughter. I hadn't spoken to anyone since, not even Aunt Clara, whose unanswered text sat heavy in my phone. Mr. Larson entered his briefcase, clicking open with a snap. He was joined by Sophie, his assistant, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a notepad clutched to her chest. She gave me a small nod, her expression soft but guarded, like she'd seen too many families fall apart in this room. Hannah and Greg arrived next, Hannah in a tailored blazer, her heels clicking with purpose. Greg's tie was loose, his smirk as sharp as ever. Mom trailed in last, her scarf knotted tightly, her gaze fixed on the floor. No one spoke, but the tension was a living thing coiling around us. Mr. Larson began, his voice dry as he sorted through papers. He mentioned tax forms, minor assets, but I barely listened. My eyes kept drifting to that envelope on his desk, the one I'd noticed last time, its wax seal glinting under the lamp. It was thicker than I remembered, the paper yellowed, my name scrawled across it in a familiar slanted script. My heart stuttered. Grandpa's handwriting. I hadn't seen it since I was a kid, when he'd send me birthday cards with pressed flowers tucked inside. Sophie caught my stare and shifted slightly, her pen pausing. Mr. Larson cleared his throat, drawing my attention. He held up the envelope, his fingers careful, like it was fragile. "This was delivered to my office 6 years ago," he said. "From your grandfather, Elise, to be opened only in your presence after your parents' will was read." My breath caught, and I leaned forward, my hands gripping the table's edge. Hannah's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "What's that?" she said, her voice sharp. Mom's scarf twitched as she adjusted it, her lips parting but silent. Mr. Larson broke the seal, the wax crumbling onto the desk. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and a small tarnished key taped to it. He began to read, his voice steady but slow, as if measuring each word. "My dearest Elise," it began, and my throat tightened at Grandpa's familiar cadence, warm even on paper. "I've watched you grow into a woman of courage and heart, qualities your parents have overlooked. They've chosen their path, but I choose you." My pulse raced, and I blinked back, tears, the room blurring at the edges. The letter went on, Grandpa's words, a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. He wrote about my kindness, my grit, how I'd sat with him in his studio painting side by side when no one else cared. He said he'd left me something only I could understand, locked away with the key. I stared at it, the metal cool and heavy in Mr. Larson's hand, my initials faintly etched into its surface. A sob caught in my chest, and I pressed my lips together, fighting to stay composed. Hannah stood her chair, scraping. "That's not fair," she said, her voice rising. "Grandpa can't just bypass the will like that." "What's in there?" She pointed at the letter, her face flushed. Greg put a hand on her arm, but his eyes were on me, cold and calculating. Mom finally spoke, her voice low but sharp. "Elise, you knew about this, didn't you? You've been scheming behind our backs." Her accusation hit like a punch, and I shook my head, my voice trapped. Scheming. I'd spent my life begging for scraps of their approval, and now I was the villain. Sophie's pen scratched faster, her eyes flicking between us, and I wondered what she saw, a family tearing itself apart, or a woman finally being seen. Mr. Larson raised a hand, his tone firm. "This is legally binding, Hannah. Your grandfather was clear." Hannah's jaw tightened, and she sat, but her glare burned into me. Mom's scarf slipped slightly, revealing a tense pulse at her neck. Greg leaned forward, his voice smooth. "Let's see the letter, Elise." Transparency, right? I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Grandpa's words were a flood washing over years of doubt, but Mom's betrayal cut deeper than ever. She thought I'd planned this, that I'd manipulated Grandpa when all I'd done was love him. My hands shook and I gripped the table harder, the keys outlined sharp in my mind. What was it for? A box, a door, a secret I wasn't ready for. The room felt too small, the air too thin, and I knew I was on the edge of something I couldn't take back. The weight of Grandpa's letter hung in the air, his words still echoing in my chest, but Mom's accusation that I'd schemed burned hotter. I opened my mouth to deny it, but Hannah cut me off, her voice slicing through the room. "You always played the victim, Elise," she said, standing again. Her hands braced on the table. Grandpa was old, confused. "You manipulated him, didn't you?" Her words were venom, and I flinched, my hands falling from the table to my lap, trembling. Greg leaned forward, his tone mockingly calm. "Let's be real, Elise. You've always been jealous of Hannah's success. This is just your way of stealing the spotlight." My stomach churned and I looked at Mom, praying she'd defend me. But she adjusted her scarf again, her silence louder than any shout. Sophie's pen stopped, her eyes, flicking to me with a flicker of something empathy maybe, but she stayed silent, her notepad a shield. Mr. Larson set the letter down, his voice firm. "That's enough. This document is authentic, and I won't tolerate baseless claims." But Hannah ignored him, turning to the room like it was her stage. She said I've worked for this family, sacrificed, while Elise just coasted, expecting handouts. Her eyes locked on mine, daring me to fight back. I wanted to, but my throat was dry, my thoughts a jumble of Grandpa's love and their hatred. A memory flashed sharp and unbidden. I was 13, sitting on Grandpa's porch, my knees scraped from a bike fall. He'd bandaged them, his hands steady, and said, "You're tougher than they know, kid. Don't let them dim you." I'd clung to that, but now with Hannah's words tearing into me, I felt like that kid again, small and bleeding with no one to bandage the wounds. Mom finally spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Elise, you've always made things harder than they needed to be. If you'd just supported Hannah, none of this would have happened." Her words were a knife twisting deep, and I gasped, the sound barely audible. She blamed me not just for today, but for everything, every fight, every moment I dared to want more. I looked at her, searching for the mother who'd once braided my hair, but she was gone, replaced by this stranger who saw me as a burden. Aunt Clara burst in from the doorway. She'd been lingering outside, listening. Her voice shook with rage. "Margaret, how dare you? This isn't Elise's fault. You and Hannah have pushed her out for years, and now you're twisting it to make her the problem." Mom's face hardened and she snapped back. "You've always been jealous of me, Clara. Stay out of my family." Clara's eyes widened and she stepped back, her hand clutching the doorframe. The room fell silent, the old wounds between them raw and bleeding. I couldn't take it anymore. My chair scraped as I stood, my voice breaking free, jagged and raw. "Stop it, all of you," I said, my hands shaking at my sides. "I've spent my life trying to be enough for you, Mom, for you, Hannah. I worked, I stayed, I believed in this family. And you've thrown it back in my face, telling me I'm nothing, that I tricked Grandpa. He saw me when none of you did." My voice cracked, tears spilling, but I didn't care. Hannah laughed, a cold, cutting sound. Oh, please, Elise. Spare us the sob story. You're embarrassing yourself. Greg nodded his smirk wider and Mom looked away, her scarf now a crumpled mess in her hands. Sophie's eyes met mine, her expression tight like she wanted to speak but couldn't. Mr. Larson started to intervene, but I barely heard him. The room spun my outburst echoing in my ears, and I felt exposed like I'd ripped open my chest for them to judge. Clara turned and left her footsteps echoing down the hall, and I wanted to follow to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. The key on the desk glinted a promise I didn't understand, but it felt like my only tether. Hannah's accusations, Mom's blame, Greg's sneers. They swirled around me a storm I couldn't outrun. I stood there, tears streaming, my heart shattered, with no idea how to pick up the pieces or what came next. The morning after the lawyer's office felt like waking from a fever dream, my eyes still raw from crying Grandpa's key heavy in my pocket. I drove to a small town an hour away where Mr. Larson had said the storage unit was, my hands tight on the wheel. The road stretched through fields of dry grass, the sky gray and heavy, mirroring the storm inside me. Hannah's accusations, Mom's blame, Clara's exit. They churned in my mind, but Grandpa's letter was louder, his faith in me, a spark I couldn't ignore. The storage facility was a squat concrete building, its orange doors faded by sun and time. I parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The key felt alive in my hand, its etched initials catching the light. I found Unit 17 rusted but sturdy, and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and the door groaned as I lifted it, revealing a dim space filled with shadows and dust. Inside, I found stacks of canvases, each one covered in Grandpa's bold, vibrant strokes, landscapes, portraits, abstracts that felt like his soul spilled onto cloth. My breath caught as I ran my fingers over one, a painting of a sunset over a lake, the colors so vivid I could almost hear the water lapping. Tucked beside it was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed, and a folded deed with my name typed neatly at the top. I knelt on the cold floor, my coat pooling around me, and opened the journal. Grandpa's handwriting filled every page, a mix of sketches and thoughts, dreams he'd never shared. He wrote about starting an art school for kids who couldn't afford it, a place where they could find their voice through paint and clay. He'd planned it all down to the curriculum, but his health had failed before he could begin. The last entry was dated a year before he died, addressed to me. Elise, you're the one to carry this. You see the world like I do. Don't let them stop you. My chest ached, not with pain but with purpose. This was what the key unlocked, not just a unit, but a legacy. I flipped through the deed next, my hands trembling. It was for a cabin in the hills, a place Grandpa had bought for quiet retreats, now mine. I pictured it small and sturdy, a refuge where I could start over. But the school was the real gift, a dream I could make real, something bigger than my family's rejection. I stood brushing dust from my jeans and pulled out my phone. I texted Leo, an art dealer I'd met years ago at one of Grandpa's gallery shows. He'd always said Grandpa's work was special, that it could fetch a price. I typed quickly, asking if he'd appraise a painting, maybe help me sell one to fund the school. My thumb hovered over send, doubt creeping in. What if I failed? What if Hannah was right and I wasn't enough? But I hit send, my heart pounding, and tucked the phone away. As I stacked the canvases, I found one that stopped me cold, a small portrait of a girl fishing her back to the viewer, her hair tied in a loose braid. It was me, maybe 12, painted with such care I could feel Grandpa's love in every brush stroke. Tears pricked my eyes, but they weren't bitter this time. He'd seen me every quiet moment, every dream I'd buried. I wrapped the painting carefully, deciding to keep it a reminder of why I was doing this. My phone buzzed, Leo already replying. He was in town and could meet tomorrow. I exhaled a shaky breath and looked around the unit, the air thick with possibility. I was scared, my hands still shaky, but something was shifting inside me, a strength I hadn't known I had. I locked the unit and stepped back into the gray morning, the key warm in my pocket, my resolve hardening with every step. Back at my apartment, I spread Grandpa's journal and the deed across my kitchen table, the late afternoon light slanting through the blinds. The storage unit's dust still clung to my hands, and the portrait of me fishing leaned against the wall, its colors glowing even in the dim room. Leo's text had set things in motion, but now I needed a plan, something real to hold on to. My fingers traced the journal's pages. Grandpa's dream of an art school feeling less like a fantasy and more like a call I could answer. I called Mia, my voice steadier than I expected. She answered on the second ring, her tone warm but cautious, like she sensed the shift in me. I told her about the storage unit, the paintings, Grandpa's vision. I said I wanted to start the school to sell a painting and make it happen. There was a pause, then she laughed, not mocking but bright, like she'd been waiting for me to wake up. "I'm in," she said. "I know people, Elise. We can do this." Her words lit something in me, a flicker of belief I hadn't felt in years. I remembered a night in high school sitting on Mia's bedroom floor sharing cheap soda and dreams. I'd wanted to be an artist then, to make something that mattered. She'd listened, her eyes fierce, and said, "You will. Don't let them steal that." I'd forgotten that girl buried her under years of trying to please my family. Now, with Mia's voice in my ear, I felt her stirring, ready to fight. My phone buzzed again, a call from Hannah. I stared at the screen, my pulse spiking. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but the fire in my chest pushed me to answer. Her voice was cold, clipped. "I heard about Grandpa's little gift," she said. "Those paintings belong to the family, Elise. You can't just take them." I gripped the phone, my knuckles white. "They're mine," I said, my voice low but firm. "Grandpa gave them to me. You got everything else, Hannah. Let this go." She laughed, sharp and bitter. "You're delusional if you think you can pull this off," she said. "You're not a leader. You're barely a part of this family." Her words stung, but they didn't break me like they would have a week ago. I hung up without responding, my hands shaking but my resolve intact. I wasn't that kid anymore, nodding to keep the peace. I was done begging for their approval. I texted Leo again, arranging to meet at a coffee shop tomorrow. Then I called Tessa, his daughter, who'd once helped market a local gallery show. I'd only met her twice, but her energy, bright, unapologetic, had stuck with me. When I explained the art school, she didn't hesitate. "I can build a website," she said. "Social media too. Let's make it big." Her enthusiasm was a jolt, like a door swinging open. I thanked her, my voice catching, and she laughed. "Girl, this is gonna be epic." I sat back, the journal open to a sketch of a classroom kids painting at easels, Grandpa's handwriting noting supplies needed. I could see it now, not just as his dream, but as mine. The cabin deed caught my eye, and I imagined it as a retreat for the school, a place for kids to escape and create. My apartment, with its peeling paint and noisy neighbors, felt too small for this new version of me, one who was building something real. A memory surfaced, quiet but vivid. I was 16 in Grandpa's studio, mixing colors while he hummed an old jazz tune. I'd spilled paint on my shirt, and he'd laughed, saying, "Art's messy, Elise. So's life. Keep going." I'd kept going, then brushing off the stain, and I'd keep going now. Hannah's threat, Mom's silence. They were stains, not walls. I could move past them. I stood and walked to the portrait, my fingers brushing the canvas. The girl in the painting wasn't just me at 12. She was me now, standing at the edge of something vast, ready to leap. I pulled a notebook from my shelf and started listing steps, contacting appraisers, researching grants, sketching a logo for the school. Each word felt like a brick building something solid where my family's rejection had tried to hollow me out. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set the notebook down and looked out my window, the city lights blurring into a soft glow. My phone was silent. No more calls from Hannah. No texts from Mom. The absence hurt, but it was a clean pain, one I could carry. I picked up the key from the table, its weight familiar now, and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't say a word, didn't need to. The quiet was enough. My decision made my path clear. The community center smelled of coffee and fresh paint, its folding chairs arranged in uneven rows under fluorescent lights. I stood at the front, my hands gripping a note card, the words I'd rehearsed blurring as I faced the small crowd. Donors, local artists, and a few curious neighbors stared back, their faces a mix of skepticism and polite interest. Mia stood by the door, giving me a thumbs up, while Tessa adjusted a projector screen, her laptop glowing with our pitch deck. I took a breath. My sweater suddenly too warm and began. I told them about Grandpa's dream, the art school for kids who needed a place to belong. I described the painting we'd sold, a vibrant landscape of rolling hills that had brought in $200,000, enough to lease a building and buy supplies. My voice shook at first, but it steadied as I spoke, each word a step away from the girl who'd sat silent in the lawyer's office. The crowd leaned in, a few nodding, and I felt a spark of hope, fragile but real. A man in a gray suit raised his hand, his glasses catching the light. He introduced himself as Paul, a philanthropist who'd grown up in foster care. He said my story reminded him of his own, of being told he'd never amount to much. He pledged $50,000 on the spot, his voice firm, and the room murmured a ripple of surprise. A woman with a floral scarf followed, offering to donate art supplies, her eyes bright with tears. I scribbled their names on my note card, my hands steady now, the weight of their trust grounding me. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp vibration that pulled me back. I ignored it, focusing on the next question, but it buzzed again, insistent. I excused myself and stepped to the side, my stomach nodding as I saw Hannah's name on the screen. She'd filed a lawsuit claiming the painting was stolen family property, demanding it back. I stared at the message, the room's warmth fading, my fingers cold. I texted Mr. Larson and he replied quickly. The deed was clear, Hannah's claim baseless. Relief washed over me, but it was thin, overshadowed by her audacity. I returned to the podium, my smile tight, and continued the pitch. Tessa flashed slides of mock-ups, of bright classroom kids painting murals, and the crowd's energy lifted again. But my mind kept drifting to Hannah's lawsuit, her refusal to let me have this one thing. I pictured her in her glass-walled office signing papers with that same smug tilt of her lips, and my chest tightened, a mix of anger and exhaustion. I'd fought so hard to get here, and she was still trying to pull me back. As the event wrapped, Paul approached me, his handshake warm. He said he'd been disowned by his family for choosing his own path, and seeing me stand up for Grandpa's dream gave him hope. His words were a balm, but they couldn't erase the sting of Hannah's message. I thanked him, my voice softer than I meant, and he nodded like he understood the weight I carried. Mia joined us, her apron smudged from helping set up, and suggested a community art show to keep the momentum going. I agreed, but my enthusiasm felt forced, the lawsuit's shadow looming. Later, as we packed up, Aunt Clara arrived, her coat buttoned to her chin. She hesitated, then hugged me, her perfume sharp and floral. She said she'd been wrong to stay silent for so long, that Grandpa had warned her about my parents' greed years ago. He'd trusted me, she said, because I had his heart. Her voice cracked, and I saw the guilt in her eyes, the years of standing by while Mom favored Hannah. I wanted to be angry, but I just felt tired. Her apology a heavy gift I wasn't ready to carry. I drove home, the city lights streaking past Clara's words, mixing with Paul's and the donors' pledges. The lawsuit was a blow, but it hadn't stopped me, not yet. Still, as I parked and sat in the quiet of my car, Hannah's message glowed on my phone, a reminder of the fight I couldn't escape. My hands rested on the steering wheel, the journal's weight in my bag beside me, and I felt frozen, caught between triumph and the ache of a family that kept pulling me under. The next morning, my apartment was quiet, the kind of stillness that presses against your skin. I sat at my kitchen table, a mug of tea gone cold in my hands, staring at the email from Mom that had arrived overnight. It was short, her words precise like a surgeon's cut. Elise, your actions have embarrassed our family. Consider this your notice, we're done. No signature, no softness, just a wall of finality. I read it again, my throat tight, waiting for tears that didn't come. Instead, a hollow ache settled in my chest, heavy as stone. I set the phone down and looked at the stack of flyers Mia had dropped off for the art show, their bright colors a stark contrast to the gray light filtering through my window. She'd worked late designing them, her handwriting scrawled on the top one. This is gonna be huge. I traced the words. Grateful for her fire. But Mom's email kept pulling me back. Done. The word echoed not just a rejection, but an erasure, like I'd never been her daughter at all. My phone lit up with a notification Mia's art show post had gone viral, shared by a local news page with comments flooding in. People were calling it inspiring a beacon for kids who felt lost. I scrolled through, my heart lifting slightly at strangers' words, but then I saw a comment from an anonymous account: greedy sisters stealing family legacy. Shameful. My stomach twisted. Hannah's work, no doubt, her lawsuit now a public smear. I closed the app, my hands unsteady, the praise soured by her shadow. I stood and walked to the window, the city humming below, indifferent to my unraveling. A memory slipped in, soft but piercing. I was 11, sitting on Mom's bed, watching her brush her hair before a gala. I'd asked if I could come, wanting just one night to feel close. She'd smiled, but it was thin, and said, "Next time, honey. Hannah needs me tonight." I'd nodded, slipping out, and spent the evening alone with a book. That promise of next time never came, and now with her email, I knew it never would. The doorbell buzzed, pulling me back. It was Tessa, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes bright with ideas. She spread her laptop on the table, showing me a website draft for the art school, clean and bold, with a gallery of Grandpa's paintings. She talked fast about press releases and donor outreach, but I caught her glancing at me like she sensed the weight I carried. "You okay?" she asked, pausing mid-sentence. I nodded, my smile forced, and said, "Just a lot to process." She didn't push, but her quiet nod felt like understanding. As we worked, my phone buzzed again. Uncle Ray. I answered, my voice flat. He sounded tired, his words careful. He said he'd seen the art show post, that it was beautiful, but Mom was furious, calling my actions a betrayal. He wanted to meet to talk, but I cut him off, saying I needed time. His silence lingered, heavy with regret, and when he hung up, I felt a pang, not for him, but for the family I'd once hoped to mend. Tessa left, promising to finalize the website, and I was alone again. I opened my laptop, pulling up the art show plans, but Mom's email glowed in my mind, her words a cold hand on my heart. The viral post, the donors. Tessa's energy, they were victories, but they couldn't fill the void she'd carved. I leaned back, my eyes on the ceiling where a crack spiderwebbed across the plaster. I felt like that crack splitting under pressure, my edges frayed but still holding. The fight was far from over, and I was tired. My heart bruised, my strength stretched thin. The cabin Grandpa left me sat nestled in a clearing, its cedar walls weathered but warm under the late afternoon sun. I'd driven up that morning, my car packed with a duffel bag and a sketch pad. The city's noise fading with every mile. The air smelled of pine and earth, and as I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaked softly like a greeting. Inside the space was small, a stone fireplace, a worn couch, a kitchen table scarred from years of use. It felt like Grandpa's solid and unpretentious, a place where I could finally breathe. I dropped my bag and walked to the window where sunlight spilled across a meadow dotted with wildflowers. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders loosened, the weight of Mom's email and Hannah's lawsuit easing just enough to let me think. I'd spent so long running toward approval, away from pain, that standing still felt foreign, almost reckless. But here, with the quiet wrapping around me, I wanted to try. I pulled out my sketch pad, the one I hadn't touched since college, and sat by the fireplace. My pencil moved slowly at first, tracing the outline of a tree outside, its branches swaying in the breeze. The lines were clumsy, but they felt honest, like a conversation I'd forgotten how to have. I thought about the art school, now fully funded, its opening just weeks away. Mia and Tessa were handling details, their texts a steady hum of progress, but this moment was mine, a pause to find the woman I was becoming. A memory surfaced, gentle and clear. I was 14, riding bikes with Grandpa down a dirt trail, my laughter trailing behind us. We'd stopped at a creek, and he'd pointed to a pebble smooth from years of water. He'd said, "Life shapes you, Elise, but you decide what kind of shine you'll have." I'd rolled my eyes then, too young to understand, but now, sketching in his cabin, I felt that shine, faint but growing polished by every choice I'd made since the will reading. My phone buzzed. Uncle Ray again. I hesitated, my thumb hovering, then answered. His voice was soft, almost tentative, like he was afraid I'd hang up. He said he'd been thinking about me, about the art school, and wanted to visit, maybe help in some way. I leaned back, the sketchpad resting on my lap, and told him I'd think about it. His offer was kind, but it stirred a flicker of caution, a reminder of the family I'd lost. I thanked him and hung up the quiet, returning softer now. I stepped outside, this grass cool under my bare feet, and walked to the meadow's edge. A bird flitted past, its wings a blur, and I closed my eyes, letting the breeze carry away the last of my tension. The cabin, the sketchpad. Ray's call, they were pieces of a new map, one I was drawing myself. I wasn't whole yet, not by a long shot, but I was here, choosing to stay, and that was enough for now. The evening settled over the cabin, the sky bruising purple as I lit a fire, its crackle filling the quiet. I sat cross-legged on the rug, Grandpa's journal open in my lap, its pages worn from my touch. I'd read more entry stories of his own fights, family who doubted him, dreams he'd had to rebuild. One line stopped me. Forgiveness isn't for them, Elise. It's for you to walk lighter. I closed the journal, my fingers lingering on the leather, his words sinking deep. I walked to the kitchen where a stack of envelopes waited, bills and art school forms, but one stood out, a blank sheet I'd pulled from my bag. I took a pen and started writing to Mom, not to send, but to release. I wrote about the years I'd chased her approval, the nights I'd cried over her distance. I wrote that I was done carrying that weight. The words flowed steady and unhurried, each one loosening a knot I'd held for too long. A knock at the door startled me. It was Mia and Tessa, their laughter spilling in as they stepped inside, arms full of takeout bags. Mia set the table, her chatter about the art school's progress, a warm hum, while Tessa scrolled through her phone, showing me new donor emails. Their presence was a gift, a reminder of the family I was building, one that chose me back. We ate, the firelight dancing across their faces, and I felt a quiet joy, small but real. As they left, Mia hugged me, her grip fierce. "You're doing it," she whispered. I nodded, my throat tight, and watched their car lights fade down the dirt road. Alone again, I stepped onto the porch, the night air cool against my skin. I found a small nook by the door, hidden behind a loose board where Grandpa had tucked a bundle of sketches, quick studies of birds, flowers, and one of me laughing, my eyes bright. I held it, my chest aching with gratitude. I went back inside and sat by the fire. The letter to Mom folded beside me. I didn't need her to read it, didn't need her to change. I'd written it for me to let go, to make room for what was coming. The art school's opening loomed, a new chapter, but tonight I was just here in this cabin with Grandpa's sketches and my own heart finally learning to rest. I leaned back, the fire's warmth on my face, and let the silence hold me steady and enough. The art school's opening day hummed with life. The old warehouse transformed into a bright space of color and sound. Kids darted between easels, their hands smudged with paint, while parents and locals wandered, their voices a soft buzz. I stood by the entrance, a clipboard in hand, my denim jacket loose over my shoulders. The air smelled of acrylics and fresh coffee, and for the first time in months my chest felt light, like I'd finally exhaled. I watched a girl, maybe 10, dip her brush into blue paint, her brow furrowed as she worked on a canvas twice her size. She reminded me of myself at that age, quiet but stubborn, finding a world in colors that words couldn't touch. I knelt beside her, asking what she was making. "A storm," she said, her voice shy but sure, and I smiled, seeing the swirl of clouds taking shape. I told her to keep going, that storms were worth painting. She nodded, her brush moving faster, and I stood, my heart full. The crowd grew, their faces a mix of curiosity and warmth. I spotted Aunt Clara near a display of student sketches, her scarf a soft green today. She caught my eye and walked over, her steps slow but deliberate. She said she'd started a scholarship in Grandpa's name, a small fund for kids like the ones here. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet, and I saw the weight of her silence over the years now lifting. I hugged her, my clipboard pressing into her back, and whispered thanks. She squeezed my hand, then stepped back, blending into the crowd. Mia was by the refreshment table pouring juice for a line of kids, her laugh cutting through the noise. Tessa flitted between guests, snapping photos for the school's website, her energy a spark that kept the day alive. They'd become my anchor, their belief in me a steady pulse through the chaos of the past months. I caught Mia's eye and she winked like we were sharing a secret. In a way, we were this school, this moment was ours, built from scraps of hope and grit. I stepped outside for a breath, the afternoon sun warm on my face. The warehouse's brick wall was covered in a mural painted by the kids, all bold lines and wild colors. I traced a yellow star with my finger, its edges uneven but fierce. This place was more than a building. It was a promise kept to Grandpa, to myself, to every kid who needed a chance. I thought about the nights I'd spent planning the doubts that had clawed at me and how each step had carved a new shape in my heart. A woman approached, her press badge clipped to her jacket. She asked about the school, her pen poised over a notebook. I told her about Grandpa's vision about the kids who'd already found a home here. She nodded, scribbling, then paused. She said she'd heard about my family, about the will, and asked how I'd kept going. I froze, the question sharp, but then I smiled, soft and real. I said I'd learned to choose my own path, to build something that mattered. She wrote that down, her eyes kind, and walked away. I leaned against the wall, the mural's texture rough under my palm. The noise from inside spilled out, a reminder of the life I'd created. Hannah and Mom hadn't come, hadn't called, and I'd heard through Ray that the lawsuit was dropped, a quiet retreat. Their absence was a dull ache, but it didn't define me anymore. I was here, surrounded by people who saw me, who stayed. I closed my eyes, the sun warm, my breath slow, and felt the world settle just for a moment. Back inside the warehouse, the opening event was winding down, the crowd thinning as kids clutched their artwork, their faces bright with pride. I walked to a quiet corner where a small display held one of Grandpa's sketches, a simple pencil drawing of a sparrow in flight. Its wings were delicate, caught mid-soar, and I stood there, my fingers brushing the frame, feeling him in the lines. This was his gift, not just the school or the cabin, but the courage to keep going, to choose my own wings. A girl approached, the same one who'd painted the storm earlier. She held out a folded paper, her hands nervous but steady. I opened it to find a drawing of a tree, its roots deep, its branches reaching wide. She said it was for me because I'd helped her feel brave. My throat tightened and I knelt to hug her, her small arms warm around my neck. Her gift was a mirror showing me how far I'd come, how my choices had rippled outward, touching lives I hadn't expected. I thought about the months since the will reading, the nights I'd lain awake wrestling with anger and doubt. I'd wanted my family to see me, to love me the way I'd loved them. But standing here surrounded by laughter and paint-splattered tables, I realized their rejection had freed me. It had forced me to look inward, to find my own worth, not in their eyes, but in the life I was building. I wasn't perfect, and the scars were still there, but I was learning to carry them with grace. Sarah, a local teacher who'd volunteered to lead classes, joined me, her apron dusted with chalk. She said the kids were already asking when they could come back, their excitement a fire she hadn't seen in years. We talked about adding evening workshops, about reaching more schools, and her quiet passion steadied me. She didn't know my story, not the details, but her trust in me felt like a bridge connecting me to a world bigger than my pain. Later, I slipped away to my car and drove to the cemetery where Grandpa rested. The gravel path crunched under my shoes, the air cool with the promise of evening. His headstone was simple, etched with his name and a single word, artist. I sat cross-legged on the grass, the girl's drawing in my lap, and spoke to him, my voice soft. I told him about the school, the kids, the way his dream had saved me. I thanked him for seeing me, for giving me a chance to see myself. The wind stirred, and I felt him there, not in some grand way, but in the quiet like he'd always been. Driving back, the road stretched dark and empty, my headlights cutting through the night. I thought about what I'd learned, not just about my family, but about myself. Worth isn't something others give you, it's what you claim piece by piece through the choices you make, the people you lift, the dreams you dare to hold. I'd spent so long waiting for permission to matter. but now I knew my life was mine to shape, and that was enough. I want to hear from you. What's a moment when you found your own strength, when you chose yourself despite the odds? Share it in the comments below. It means the world to connect with you. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, or share it with someone who needs it. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for carrying your own light. Here's to healing, to growing, and to finding peace in the journey ahead.